welcome everyone. I'm Neil, and so tonight we have Andrew Simon, author of Columbus Travels, The Seven Sands of Iona, with Jane Sandel, who's a children's book specialist and reviewer. So as I said, I'm Neil, and I work for Wild Goose, and I work with the great Sandra Kramer, the great Jane Riley, the great Gail Ulrich, and Iona the Great, who's doing the Zoom for us tonight. Thanks very much for doing that, Iona. Okay, so tonight, yeah, it's Andrew Simon in conversation with Jane. And here's the cover, lovely cover of the book, if you can see it. Let's see, there we go. Amazing, striking cover. And the cover design was by Tobin Lewis, who lives on Iona. So we thank Tobin for that. And I'll read a bit of the blurb. Pilgrim penitent and skilled in politics, Columba organizes his fellow monks on Iona into a missionary force to bring the gospel to Dalriada and Alba, what we now call Scotland. Columbus Travels recounts the monks' journeys to Mull, the Isle of Miss, and even the pagan king's fortress near Inverness. Often facing danger, they witness to people enthralled to druids and warlords. Flawed but fearless, Columba leads by example, demonstrating an unwavering commitment to the core of the gospel. And Jane, on the back of Jane Sandel at the back of the book, says, Andrew brings to life these characters from long ago who have made such an indelible mark on Scotland's history, culture, and life. An accessible read for young people. And it is a book for young folk. But I enjoyed it too. I mean, I think the best books for young people also, appeal to adults, like Wind in the Willows and Winnie the Pooh, the two obvious examples that I can think of off the top of my head. I guess that's good for an intro, isn't it? I could just hand things over, I think, now to Andrew and Jane, and they'll have a chat, and then we'll come back and you can ask some questions or make some comments, and maybe you'll win a free book too. Who knows? Enjoy.
Well, hello, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. Talking with Andrew and promoting his latest book, which I too read and enjoyed. Those of you who've read much C.S. Lewis will remember that he also said that a good children's book was only a good children's book if it could also be read by adults. And I think that's a pretty good gauge. You can't really argue with C.S. Lewis too much, can you? Anyway, Andrew, it's lovely to see you again and to be having another conversation with you. Do you think you could just tell us a little bit about yourself?
About myself? Oh, well, I stay in Perth. I've been here for 30 years, but I'm a bit of a nomad. My family history is a bit of a nomadic one. My father came from Inverness. My mother was from Aberdeen. They both moved south in the 1950s to London and met there at St. Columba's Church, at the dancing at St. Columba's Church, and then moved abroad, and I was born abroad. And then my father died when I was 2, and my mother decided that London in the 1960s was a groovy place to bring up 3 young children, 3 of us under the age of 4. And so as a young widow, she came back to London and decided that was where it is. So St. Columba's Church was my home church growing up from the age of 2. And that's one of the formative influences there, because Fraser McCluskey was the minister at the time. We went every week, and it was just a very, very significant part of my upbringing till the age of 18 when I left London. So I'm married. I've got 2 sons. They're now 30 and 28, and I became a grandfather 3 weeks ago. So we're rather buzzing with excitement here as well. Vary was born 3 weeks ago today. So we're all very pleased with ourselves here in Perth. My 2 sons stay in Perth. My wife is Maggie, who was a paediatrician, is retired now. She took early-ish retirement and hasn't looked back since. So that's me.
Excellent. Now, Columbus Travels isn't your first book for young people. Your earlier books that I also read were kind of fantasy and a bit kind of mystical in a very broad sense, which I guess Columba is too. Do you write the kind of books that you would have liked to read as a young person?
Oh, that's a good question. But the my earlier books, it was a trilogy called, it was Jack Sheehan and there was 3 books in the trilogy, and it's an otherworld story which is really based in the Scottish otherworld, which is the lands of, and you hate to say things like fairies and fauns and elves and whatnot. That's what people call them, but they get the mistaken impression if you say fairy, they think Tinkerbell, and it's nothing like Tinkerbell. So these were fantasy stories written in the Scottish tradition, which had gone out of fashion. In the 1950s and 60s, it was Buzz Lightyear and his, antecedents. When people saw strange things in the sky in the past, they attributed to the fairy host moving about the Slúch. And then suddenly it became UFOs and aliens and men in spacesuits. And so people reinterpreted things or interpreted them in a different way. And I thought it was a bit of a shame that these stories, which have been told around the fireside and winter nights for hundreds of years, had kind of gone away. So I thought I'll bring them back. And it really was with my own sons in mind. They were the right age. And it was partly out of children's storytelling at night. They would go bedtime stories. The 2 of them went to bed at the same time, and they would get stories. And as the way with children, they often wanted the same story read again and again and again. And they got to the stage where I think we were on number 35 reading of this particular book, and I was getting really rather bored with it. So I changed something in the telling of it, and the 2 sons reacted absolutely differently. That one of them was so opposed to it. So I wasn't allowed to do that. I had to read what was on the page. It was black and white. You have to read what's on the page, and that's that. And my other son, my younger son, who's much more creative, just I thought, oh, so if this happens, then what happens next? And he could just see all these possibilities opening up. And I thought, yes, you're right. So I thought, let's take some stories and just twist them a little bit. So my earliest stories were set underneath Edinburgh Castle in the Sheehan Square, which is opened up after years because the Stone of Destiny has come back to Scotland, and that re-energizes and opens up all the otherworld spaces again. So that's where that came from. It was really from bedtime stories of my own son. So I guess, yes, I do write the kind of books that I think children would be interested in. And with Columba's travels, it's a little bit different because it's not. It's an imagined account of his travels, so it's not truly fiction, but it's a fictionalized account based on what limited evidence we have about what we know about Columba and how he arrived in Iona and how he travelled from Iona to various other places around what is now Scotland. So I had to imagine quite a lot, but I was drawing on a lot of sources. Came across a wonderful book years ago. You can see that one.
Yes.
Feel like an artist, and it's this notion that everything is derivative, that really nothing is truly, or at least it's most exceptional for things to be truly unique and really coming out of nowhere else. So this thing about Steele like an artist is that you do it and don't be ashamed about it. Acknowledge it, don't plagiarize, but acknowledge where your sources are. So I used all the available sources I could find really about Columba from Adamnan's life story, which is a hagiography of its time. And it was written 100 years after Columba died, but it was very much to say how saintly and wonderful this man was and all these wonderful things he could do, so the prophecies and the miracles and the healings. So it's very much to sort of big him up in that sense. But there's many other books I read as well. Ian Bradley's book on Columba is very good, very, very helpful. Lots of other books about the importance of Columba. And he's really a foundational part of Scotland, because he was the first one that put the church and the state together. He consecrated a king for the very first time. It's the first time in Europe that this is actually recorded, that a senior cleric consecrates a king when he becomes king. So Columba was instrumental in forging what became Scotland. He's a most important historical figure. And it was interesting when I was on the island a number of years ago, and in the community shop, as you browse around, and having written these other children's stories, which were in the bookshop for a while, Salome, the then manager, was very keen, and she stocked them for a while. I noticed that there really wasn't much on Columba, or there wasn't really anything on Columba for that sort of late primary school, early secondary school readers. And I thought that was a shame, because it is such a good story to be told there. There's a wealth of information, a wealth of conjecture you can put onto some of the known facts, but you can have great fun in retelling those stories and bringing that to life. And so I thought, that's what I'll do. So I nagged Neil, at Wild Goose a while, because when I think I first mentioned the possibility that, well, we don't do fiction, it's really not really within our remit. But I must have nagged enough, because eventually he said, well, write it and send it to me and I'll have a look. So I did, and I gathered, and in fact, somebody else has published fiction just not that long ago, so I'm not quite first out of the gate on that one. But
beginning of a trend.
Yes. Does that answer your question? That was a very long answer. Did I ramble?
I think that kind of answers my question, yes. So you mentioned Iona there. I guess you knew Iona before you started writing the book. Did you go back to the island for research or for inspiration as you were writing?
Yes, well, I now go about twice a year to Iona, so I'm a very frequent visitor. I'm a member of the communities, and I've stayed in various places around the island. I discovered the island before I discovered the community, in truth. I was told that it was a wonderful place to go, and I heard John Bell talk in 1991, I think, 1989 in Edinburgh, and I thought, oh, that's an interesting place. I must go there. And it took me a couple of years to go. But I fell in love with the island absolutely the first time. It was a wrench to leave. It really was. I almost just went straight back again. But I went to the Abbey and I got, attended the services and found out more about the community, and then became an associate member a number of years ago. And then eventually, about 5 years ago, I became a member. So I fell in love with the island first. And so, yes, I did go back and look at the places that I was writing about just to remind myself. So there was some accuracies about when I was describing something. I didn't want to be sort of wildly inaccurate about that. I actually had the name, the Seven Sands of Iona. That was what came to me first.
That's the subtitle of the book.
It's become the subtitle. And I was wondering how to write this book called The Seven Sands of Iona, because I had the title before I had the book, and I thought it was going to be something completely different actually when I started writing. And then I realized that wasn't working at all, and it was better off told as a story about Columba, who, as I say, needs to have a story told for younger readers.
So, okay, so you've written about Columba partly because of your Iona connection, your strong affinity for the island. But why Columba? Why not one of the other saints of that period? Why is he so important?
Well, because I suppose within the Iona community, especially, and on Iona, it's his name that resonates. If you ask people, what do you know about St. Columba? A lot of people would say, oh, he was in Iona. But often they struggle to get much beyond that in terms of details about what else do they know about him. But it's really, Columba is the name. Having read quite a bit of George MacLeod's writings, and he founded the Iona community, he draws on this Columban tradition very purposively, sometimes it possibly a little bit mischievously. And I'd like to think, from what I've heard of it, I never met him sadly, but I think in terms of character, they probably shared quite a number of characteristics in terms of being very, very powerful, strong leaders, very determined. They got their way more often than not, and didn't really brook too much by way of people coming up against them. But they're very effective. I mean, they were both very effective men. They got things done and they achieved things. So it's really Columba's name that stands out for me. As I say, and as somebody who grew up in a church called St. Columba's, it was very much a name that just was with me all the way through. I can't remember not knowing the name.
Yeah, and I guess you're right. I guess if you say Columba to people, it'll be recognised because churches and schools, colleges have been named after Columba, particularly in Scotland and the kind of where the Scottish diaspora has ended up. I famously went to New Zealand specifically to visit Columba College in Dunedin, but that's another story. So you mentioned before that your book is a mixture of fact and fiction. How much is fact and how much is out of your own head?
Well, I mean, I read all the sources I could really find to say, well, what do we know about Columba? And this, I don't do Columba in Ireland, and that's it. People have asked me why didn't you start in Ireland? It would have been a different book that way, and I've really wanted it to centre on Iona. And so Iona is either the end or the start of journeys, and that's the point of the book, and that's the hook, if you like. So I'm sort of wandered off there. What was the question?
I would just actually ask about the balance between fact and
fact and fiction. Yes, so I read really what I could, everything I could find. So Adamnan's book is very informative. Ian Bradley's book is very informative. to know about what he did. What do we know about what he did? And I tried to reflect an awful lot of what Adamnan wrote about in terms of what do we know about Columba's powers. I mean, and he was writing a hagiography to say, you know, how wonderful this man was, what a saint he was. But what do we know about his ability to predict the future, or to read the elements, or to heal? And I wanted to try and see what Adam mentions lots of little stories out there. There's lots of little anecdotes and stories that run all the way through Adamnan. I wanted to, I collated those and thought, well, I want to tell a story about him healing. I want to tell a story about him predicting the weather or controlling the weather. It's not controlling, but it's being able to read the elements really well. About him being able to outcurse the druids, because that's one of the big things about you can outcurse a druid. That's a very powerful thing to be able to do. And that does go back to Ireland, but it's something that I've imported into the stories with the druids in Scotland. So it's fictionalized based on what we do know, but we have to acknowledge that what we do know is not a sort of straightforward history that we would expect of more recent figures in Scotland's history.
Mm. Who do you think this book is for, Andrew? Is it for people who have some background in the Christian faith? Is it for people who are interested in history? Is it for adults, children? Is it for everybody?
I think it probably ticks a number of boxes because it is an adventure story. And I've written it in the style of an adventure story about lots of journeys. So there's travel and there's tension as you meet different people and encounter danger and all the rest. So I've written it like an adventure story so that it is appealing to younger readers. And I've pitched it. I kind of thought it was maybe 9 to 12, but I think it's probably a bit older. It's 9 to 14. And as Neil said, if adults can read the book and think, oh, that's quite interesting. So I've written it really for people who know the name Columba or have been told a bit about Columba, but want to find out more. And it's a way of opening up the stories. And I think hopefully from then they'll say, well, okay, I know a little bit about him, or at least an imagining of what he did when he was up in his missionary endeavours around Scotland. And I want to find out more either about Columba or Scotland or Iona or the Iona community. So I'm hoping it's a teaser. It's like a magnet that will pull people in and they want to find out more.
Mm. How did you decide what stories to include in the book? I guess there's a lot more to Columba's travels than have been included in this book. Will there be a second book in the series?
Well, it's an interesting one, but the way that the book is actually set up, it's told in retrospect, in flashback. So there are 7 parts to it, which are the 7 sands of Iona. But at the very start and at the end of each chapter, we go to Columba's wake. He's just died, and the monks are holding a wake for Columba in the Irish tradition. And so, having done that and having ended with his death, and we get to very close to his death in the very final chapter, when he goes over to the west side of the island and has this encounter with the angels, or is it the fairy host? It'd be interesting. I think it would be a little tricky to try and write the intermediate stories, but there's no shortage of stories. So I guess in potentially, yes, there would be a sequel. There's an unrelated story about Iona and about a monk a couple of hundred years later, centering around Martha's Bay and the slaughter that took place there. But that's a Viking story. And it's very different, and it's not for younger readers particularly, because Viking stories are not really younger reading.
Not unless they're retold quite significantly.
Well, yes.
So tell us then, how did you choose these 7 stories?
Well, there's more than 7 in there because although the book is in 7 parts, there are more chapters than that. And the 7 parts relate to the journeys to or from a particular bay or beach, and that's I've contrived to get the 7 sands in that way. So there's many more stories. There are 22 chapters, I think, and each one is a self-contained story. Although there is obviously a thread within them, particularly within each of the 7 parts. I chose them really because, across what Adamnan was saying about Columba, I wanted to say a bit about the different features of his character. So here he is, being very kind and gentle, and here he is being very fierce and determined and challenging, and here he is healing, and here he is reading the weathers, and here he is in his statecraft, because he grew up in the royal courts in Ireland. He was royal lineage himself. He understood politics. So it's when he goes to see the king in Donad in Argyll. So I have a little bit of different aspects of his character, and I wanted to draw those different aspects out to show that he was a very multifaceted man.
Okay. Would you like to read to us a little bit of one of the stories, or a favourite passage from the book?
Well, now, with apologies if there's any Irish listeners here, I'm going to start with the very start of the prologue, and it's the wake. And then I'm going to nip quickly to a bit in the next bit where the Druids are having a meeting to discuss, what are we going to do with these new arrivals on the island. So this is the very start of the book. It's Columba's wake, and the opening speaker is Dermot, who was Columba's attendant and had been his attendant for since they arrived from Ireland, so for well over 30 years. And they're telling stories at the wake, and that's the tradition. The fury of fire shall devour those who refuse to believe that Christ came from God the Father. Despite the sombre occasion, there was a ripple of laughter at Brother Dermot's proclamation. Brothers, admonished Baitheen wearily, looking around the hut, 'tis a solemn wake we attend. We're not here simply to talk of courses. Talk of courses. Dermot smiled as he remembered again how Baitheen's Irish accent got stronger when he was tired, stronger even than the abbot fathers. I meant no levity in talking of curses, Brother Baitheen, said Dermot earnestly, but you'll admit that the abbot father could out-curse the Druids, and that was my favourite one. The Druid dropped dead on the spot. So I've introduced early on some of the tension that there obviously was with the Druids, but I'm at pains to say that that's not always the story. That there was conflict with the Druids as he tried to challenge them, but they also show that they were there to correct them and bring them into the light, and show them what they knew some things partially, but they didn't understand fully, and so they were there to correct and educate them where they were in error. So I had the main Druid, or the main Druid's son, was watching the arrival when Columba and his 12 monks, sorry, not apostles, arrive on the island with him. And the chief Druid says, "What of their leader?" "Even from what I saw, he has great authority," replied the Banfillid. She's the seer. The old Druid turned to look at her. "You are a wise Banfillid, Fidel, but tell me what you mean." "The men follow willingly. They respect him and trust him. To arrive unarmed is a powerful statement of faith in their leader." "And he saw us," added Nectan. "He was leading them up the path to the loch, and he just stopped and turned and looked straight at us. Then he waved and bowed his head. I believe we must meet with him and his men." "What think you, Morleo?" Chief Druid turned now to his oldest son. "They threaten our very way of life. If they come here and perform their magic tricks, as we have heard they do, then the people will turn away from the old ways, away from us." So I've got tension there between some of the Druids. They're not quite sure what to make of them. Some are very opposed. Others think, well, let's see what they're like and what can we learn from them. If they help us learn, that maybe gives us more power. So there's tension there. And later on, and the other contrivance I've got is for a younger reader, is that most of the stories are told with a youngster at the wake. He's a local island boy. He's 14, called Gallum. And so they're explaining things to Gallum. And that's the way we kind of tease things out a bit. After every chapter, we go back to the wake and they tease things out so that Gallum understands. And Gallum's mother's life was saved by Columba. And that's the family connection, why he feels indebted to Columba, because his mother was saved at birth by Columba, and his granny was saved. His granny's life was saved in childbirth. So I'm trying to draw little connections in there just to try and show that he was many things at different times to different people, but he always made a big impact.
That's an interesting point. Do you think that Columba is somebody we should admire? He had a kind of checkered past, from the little I know of him. Do you think we would consider Columba a good man?
Well, it's interesting, actually. If you look at the lives of almost any of the saints, anyone you can think of in the Book of Saints, they're not perfect. None of them are perfect. And none of the biblical characters are perfect. They all have flaws. So he was human. He was clearly flawed. Now, I think what you're probably alluding to is the reason why he left Ireland, which is, there's debate about that. I mean, there's conjecture about the reasons, but one of the posited reasons is that he was involved in a clan battle arising out of a copyright dispute when he copied a gospel without permission, and the judgment went against him, and he had to give up his copy, and the clan battle resulted with 3,000 men killed, and he was charged this what's called white martyrdom of going away and winning back 3,000 souls for Christ. So that's one of the possible reasons why he left Ireland in the first place, although that's, as I say, I think scholars are there's more than one opinion on what may have led behind that. He wasn't moving to an entirely different country, because what is Argyll, most of Argyll was known as Dalriada at the time, and Dalriada was also in Ireland. It was the Antrim coast, the northeast part of Ireland was also Dalriada, so they were kind of part of the same kingdom. So he wasn't moving to a completely different country to begin with, but when they move up past Mull and past Lismore up into the Great Glen, then they're up into Pictoland, into Alba, and that is a different country, and they spoke a different language, although it's a Celtic language. It's markedly different, and they did need interpreters there. So he's a man that I think we would say was flawed, but like all great men who achieve great things, he had I wouldn't say skeletons in the cupboard, but times in his past that maybe he wasn't the most proud of. But that's his humanity. Much as Adamnan's life of him tends to suggest that he was pretty close to Christ himself. There are very obvious links that Adamnan draws in terms of the 12 men who accompanied him, and the things, the healing and the feeding and all the rest, the things that Jesus does in the Gospels. Columba does an awful lot of that, according to Adamnan's history.
So, to misquote, what's Columba ever done for us?
Well, as I say, Scotland may not have existed without Columba, although he predates Scotland. His pulling together of church and state was very significant, because it wedded the power of the church and the state together. Now, we can argue whether church and state should be separated or together, but it was different times then, and he was trying to forge an effective missionary force, and he couldn't do that without political power behind him to guarantee a degree of safety as he went into these pagan lands. So it was a necessary step he took, but as I say, without that wedding of church and state, Scotland would not have developed in the way it did in the medieval period, and then who knows what it would have developed like and what we would be today. So he's foundational in Scottish terms. And the other really interesting thing is that the St. Columba's churches are claimed by Church of Scotland, Free Church of Scotland, Episcopal Church of Scotland, and Roman Catholic churches. So everyone wants a bit of Columba. They all think he's one of theirs. And they all have different reasons, and they're for different reasons. Each one can say, because of these things that he did, he's in our tradition. And it's really interesting, but everybody wants him.
Excellent. One final question, and this is really just to gratify my own curiosity. What do you like to read when you've got a free choice?
Oh, I've got several books on the go at the moment. I'm reading Jeremy Hardy's My Family and Other Strangers, or Other Strange People, or something like that. I'm reading Karen Armstrong's A History of God, which I have to say is a little bit above my head, I think, sometimes. I think there's things in it that I'm struggling with. I'm reading Frank Skinner's A Comedian's Prayer book, which is rather good.
Okay, don't know that.
The First Paul, which is about teasing out who wrote all the Pauline epistles. And there's a lot of biblical scholarship that says now there's actually 2 or 3 Pauls. In fact, there's not just one. And so when people disagree, but so Paul said this, or Paul said that, and they're contradictory, so well, it's probably almost certainly, in fact, 2 or possibly 3 different people writing with different agendas and different thoughts. So I've got quite an eclectic taste. One thing I mean, one of my great reading heroes growing up, I wasn't very imaginative growing up, but when I hooked onto somebody, I loved it, was Spike Milligan. Spike Milligan made me roar with laughter time and time and time again. And having read one of his books after I went for an interview in Wiltshire, I missed the train. I went to a bookshop to buy something just to tide me over till the next train. And I bought his first war autobiography, and I read it on the train on the way back. And this was in the south of England, and I laughed and laughed and laughed. And you don't do that in English trains. I discovered it's not the done thing. So I laughed and laughed. So I actually quote Spike at the start of this because it's my disclaimer. I should maybe have started with this. He starts his second war autobiography with this quote: "I have not ventured to speak from any chance information, nor according to any notion of my own. I have described nothing but what I saw myself or learned from others of whom I made the most careful and particular inquiry. And that is Thucydides writing in the Peloponnesian War." And Spike Milligan quotes that. Now, his comment on that one, it says, "I just jazzed mine up a bit." And I said, well, that's the approach of the rigorous historian. Historical accounts try as far as possible and within their context to tell facts. Stories, on the other hand, tell truths, not facts. This is not a history book. These are some of the stories about St. Columba's journeys to and from Iona. So I still read Spike occasionally because he still makes me laugh. Yes, I say eclectic reading taste.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I dare say that people other than I have questions that they would like to ask you. So I'm going to hand over to Neil, perhaps, to see if people have questions for you.
Okay. Thanks both. That was a great conversation. I'm sure when we put this on the YouTube channel, lots of people are going to enjoy it, get a lot from it. So if you're out there and you want to win a free book, possibly, let's see what the question could be. It could be, tell me what St. Columba's feast day is. That's an easy question. You could look that up on the internet. I'd never know. Just email me the answer, Neil, Neil, at ionabooks.com. Might be a few days before I pick that up, maybe to the week after this one. If you can wait that long with anticipation, I'll let you know. I'll give the first person who gives me the right answer a free book. What is St. Columba's feast day? Neil at ionabooks.com. Easy. Okay, well, does anyone out there have a question?
I have a wee question for you, Andrew. I've only managed to get a couple of chapters in, I'll be honest. I've not had enough time quite to get dug into it. But I find the use of language that you've got really interesting. The difference between using Irish English, sort of dialects, using obviously the Celtic words and making it readable for young people in English. Did you find that easy, or was it hard to get it right? Was it very intentional? When you read it, it sounded like it just flowed, but I don't know.
Thank you. That's interesting. It was actually, I put drafts of this out for review to get comments from people whose opinion I would respect. And one of them was that I hadn't got enough distinction in the voices, that there had to be different voices there. So I thought, well, most of these monks have come from Ireland. Now, obviously, it's not Irish English as we hear it today. But one of my very favourite authors is Lynn Doyle. Lynn Doyle was a man called Hugh Montgomery, and Lynn Doyle was it was Lynn C. Doyle. He had middle initial C, and it was Lindsay Doyle. He was in the shop one day and he saw some Lindsay Doyle behind the counter, and he thought Lindsay Doyle was a great pseudonym. So he took that. That's his nom de plume. And he wrote these fantastic stories about this borderland. The first one came out in 1905 or 1908. And about every 5 years, he would produce a new edition. And the stories, they're called Ballygullion. And there's various things about back to Ballygullion. The first one's just Ballygullion. And he has this Northern Irish, it's County Down accent, and that comes through. And so I copied a little. I had to water it down because his accents are really quite strong. He's got very strong country voices in there. And they would sort of drop. So a drop becomes drop. So D-H-T-R-O-P, drop. And I tried to mimic some of that while not making it too dense. readers who, I mean, particularly younger readers, because I was conscious that if I'm aiming this at 9-year-olds and up, they've got to be able to get what I'm saying. So I can't make it too obscure. I can't be too thick an accent, if that's the right word. It had to be something that showed there was a difference there, but was not that different. And I hope that comes across. There's a few Gaelic words, I think, that not many though. Was it Gaelic you were thinking of? I'm trying to think.
Mostly place names, and
place
of course character names as well.
Right, the character names were ones that I think are reasonably accurate to the time. That the Irish ones and the Pictish names are ones that I researched, and I felt they're reasonably accurate. Rosemary Power tells me that one of them, Brother Taj, was not, because that name Taj was not known then, but because the name means storyteller, I thought, no, I'm having Taj as one of the monks, even if the name Taj was not particularly common in the 6th century. So I did research on the names to try and use early Irish names where I could, and early Pictish names for the Dalriadans in Argyll.
I have a question about the cover, because often we have to design our own covers, but you came to us with the artwork this time. So tell me about commissioning that illustration and when you saw it, and how in your head physically you saw Columba when you saw that drawing.
I had a similar picture. It's the start of it was the I don't know if you know St Margaret's Chapel in Edinburgh Castle. But there's a picture of Columba standing in the prow of a boat. He's kind of 3/4 profile, and he's got the hood up, and he's got the bishop's, he's got a crook in his hand. So I used that as the start of it. But actually, it's my niece, who's an illustration student in Duncan of Jordanson in Dundee. She did the picture of Columba and the boat. I did the island, the outline of the island, but it was Tobin Lewis who put it together in this format. It's a mixture. I wanted something quite, and yes, the 7-pointed star is the 7 sands of Iona, and I've got that I got from a little silver brooch. I don't know if you can see that, but it's very unusual. It's in the style of Alexander Ritchie, but it's not actually one of his. But it's beautiful. Celtic knotwork in that one. So that was one of the things that 7 Sands of Iona, that was buzzing around in my head. And also on the back, you can see that there is a dove and also a fox. Fox down there, you see that one, and a dove obviously up there. Now, Columba had 2 names at birth, and one was Crinthon, which means fox, and one was Colum Keel, which is dove, or dove at the church, but he was Colum. So he had 2 names, which was Dove and Fox, and the different aspects of his character, his personality, I think are maybe quite represented. A man of peace, but he was as cunning as a fox as well. And this is true of him, I think. So so yes, I've done it. It happens to be because of the nice blues in it and the greenish, but it happens to be quite sort of in the house. It's consonant with the Iona Community's current sort of branding.
Well, I think she did a lovely job, because the thing I like about it, to me, it almost looks like a still from an animation. Like I in my head, I can see that then being a little animated series of the adventures, because there's something about the way that it is in the flat color works for me as an animated still. So
well, I like the cover.
Let's work on that next.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Somebody said when I did the launch on Iona about 3-4 weeks ago, and I did 2 or 3 extracts, and they said that would be a good audiobook, and it hadn't ever occurred to me about doing an audiobook. So, I mean, if these things are possible, then great. We can explore that. But I mean, I think quite visually myself, so I like a very strong cover that will attract, because if younger readers are the prime audience, I'm conscious that if it's in the bookshop on Iona, it's not going to be younger readers particularly who are buying it, but it's going to be parents and grandparents who are buying it for younger members of their family. But it has to be something that stands out, and they think, oh yes, they'll like that. And I hope for younger readers as well that they'll like that. So I think anyone with any knowledge of Columba ought to be intrigued enough to look at it and think about buying it. So I've written to every Columbus church I can find in Scotland saying, you need to know about this. And I've just written, I've written to all the schools, the St. Columbus schools, and there's quite a lot of them. And there's 4 in England, which slightly surprised me because I don't think we ever know of him going to England, apart from the one in London. There's one in Wallsend near Newcastle, there's Cumbria, I can't remember where the others are. One in Kent, St. Columbus in Kent. I mean, how did that get there? So Columba has travelled beyond where he travelled in his lifetime. His name, it's all around Scotland. If you look at the map of the places that are associated with Columba, whether it's a church or a well, or a school, it's just all over the Central Highlands going up towards Inverness. And we know he was up the islands. So he was in the small isles, Tiree, Col, up to Skye, possibly the outer isles, I don't know. But there's a Columbus church in Orkney as well. And I don't think there's any evidence that he ever went as far as Orkney, but his name was taken up there, clearly by monks in the same tradition.
So Andrew, if people listening to this either live just now or on YouTube later on are interested, are you willing and able to go out and talk about the book and a little bit about Columba to different groups?
Certainly, yes. I mean, I did this with my earlier children's stories. I did quite a lot of primary school talks because it was aimed at 9 to 12-year-olds, libraries, book clubs, as well as Rotary clubs and other adult meetings. So yes, I'm very prepared to do that as long as it's feasible. It's very scattered. That's the nature of it, is that there's the churches are scattered all over the place and the schools are as well. So, but yes, I'm very keen to do that because word of mouth is good advertising. So I'm happy to go out there where it's feasible and do talks.
And people get in touch with you through Wild Goose?
Yes, I've produced some bookmarks and postcards that advertise Iona books, because that's, I think, the principal place where people should be buying it. It's in Waterstones. The Waterstones in Oban is quite keen. The one in Perth has had some copies, but they're not having a lot of stock. I think I'm not sure how many they think they'll stock, but the one in Oban, they've got a big section on Mull and Iona just as you go in. It's very close to the door. So I think they, when I went in there on the way back from the book launch, they'd already had people in there asking for the book. So I think they feel that it will be attractive to buyers there. But yes, you can contact me through, I don't think I put my details on there. I haven't put my details on the on the postcards, but there is a Facebook page and people can message me on the Facebook page. That's how I thought it would be done. The Columbus Travels is the name of the Facebook page. Keep it simple.
Okay, great. Thanks again. Wish you a good evening, and thanks again, Jane and Andrew. Take care.